All right, we are up to lesson 6 of unit 3. So let's take a look at the lesson notes here. Okay, we know, and I've said this numerous times in the past, we know that squaring and square rooting are opposites of each other. That's how we undo each of those operations. So, for example, in number 1 here, if I had the equation x squared equals 9, I would solve that by square rooting both sides of the equal sign to get rid of the squared. And therefore, it would have two solutions. X would equal +3 or -3. Okay, remember, with square roots, we have to do the plus or minus. So x could equal 3 because 3 squared we know equals 9. But it could also equal -3 because if I square -3, it's also equal to 9. But if I change the equation, like in number 2, if I made it the square root of x equals 9, that equation would only have one solution. Okay? All right. How would I get rid of the square root? Well, the opposite of square rooting is squaring. So I would solve, like it says here, by squaring both sides. So I would end up with x equals 9 squared, which I know is 81. Okay. So x equals 81 because the square root of 81 is 9, but it cannot equal -81. Okay. We can't do plus minus there because I can't take the square root of a negative in this real number system. So an equation like number 2 only has one solution. Okay. Now, number 3, where I have the square root of x equals -9, it has no solution. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, wait a second, I could square both sides. Right, I could square both sides and get x equals -9 squared, which is 81. And that seems very a rational way of thinking, but it turns out you can't do that here. And the reason being, as it says here, you cannot take the square root of a number and have the answer only be negative. I can take the square root of a number. If I take the square root of a positive number, because I can't take the square root of a negative number, if I take the square root of a number, the answer could be positive or negative, right? The square root of 25 could be 5 or -5. The square root of 36 could be 6 or -6. It could be positive or it could be negative, but it can't only be negative. It is impossible to take the square root of a positive number and have the answer just be negative. Okay? It's going to be positive or negative, but it can't just be negative. So when you have an equation like number 3, the square root of x equals -9, we're going to say that has no real solution, because I cannot square root a number and have the answer just be negative. So with that in mind, let's look at the examples here. So I have 5 equations here, similar to what you saw in the lesson notes. So find the real solution or real solutions to each equation if there are any. Okay, so for number 1, I have x squared equals 100. So that one is going to have 2 solutions because I will solve it by taking the square root of both sides. Okay, so those cancel, and I will get x equals +10 or -10. So this one has 2 solutions. Similarly, number 2 will also have 2 solutions, right? Because I have z squared equals 25. I will take the square root of both sides to cancel that out, and I'll get z equals +5 or -5. So number 1 and number 2 have 2 solutions. Number 3, the square root of y equals 10. To solve that one, instead of square rooting both sides, I'm going to square both sides because the squared and the square root will cancel each other out here. So I end up with y equals 10 squared, which is 100. I'm not going to do plus or minus here, right? Because I could square root 100 to get 10, but I can't square root negative 100. So this one only has one solution. Okay, so these two have two solutions. This one has one solution. Okay, number 4. Okay, that goes back to the last thing from our lesson notes. Okay, in this one, it was the square root of x equals negative 9. This one is the square root of a equals negative 1. This one has no solution. I cannot take the square root of a number and have the answer just be negative. It could be positive or negative, but it can't just be negative. So number 4 has no solution. Okay. Number 5 is a little tricky because I have square roots on both sides, but that one is still going to have one solution because I can square both sides because this squared will cancel out this square root and this squared will cancel out this square root, and I'll simply end up with w equals 2. I'll end up with w equals 2, so this one also has one solution. So to sum up here, if I have an equation like number 1 or number 2 where I have x squared equals a positive number, there are two solutions. If I have an equation like, say, number 3 and number 5 where I have the square root of x equals a positive number, that has one solution. If I have an equation like number 4 where I have the square root of x, or in this case a, equals a negative number, that has no real solution. And that is it for lesson 6.